Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Jewish History. My name is Judy Siegel, and I'm the Director of Academic and Public Programs here at the Center. We're delighted to have you all here, this wonderful audience, for our symposium this afternoon, which is called Portugal and the Jewish Refugee Crisis of World War II. The Center for Jewish History is the home to 5 partner organizations: the American Sephardi Federation, the American Jewish Historical Society, Leo Baeck Institute, YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and Yeshiva University Museum. Together, they have collections that number about 100 million archival documents and 500,000 volumes, which makes this the largest repository of modern Jewish history in the world. 2 of our partners today, the American Sephardi Federation and Leo Baeck Institute, are co-sponsors of the event, and we are delighted that they are participating with us. And one of the collections, which is actually housed here in Leo Baeck Institute, that of the Lesser family, is on display in a case in the Great Hall. You will hear more about that at the end of our formal presentations this afternoon. So many of the stories of World War II and the Jews are told within these archives, and the one we tell today is certainly one of them. The country of Portugal, under the dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, remained neutral throughout the war, and Lisbon, its port city, served as an active transit stop on the way from Nazi-occupied Europe through to freedom. Thousands crossed through the Iberian Peninsula, moving from Spain to Portugal. Some were quite famous, like Heinrich Mann, who was the brother of Thomas Mann, Alma Mahler, who was the widow of the composer, and the writer Franz Werfel. Most were not. Countless aid organizations set up camp in Portugal, where throughout the war, Lisbon remained a last hope for refugees trying to find passage to safer ports. For some, it was just a stop until transit and entry visas could be obtained on the way to the United States and South America. For others, it became home. For some, the only home they ever knew. And some were able to get to Portugal only through the courageous acts of defiance of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese Consul-General in Bordeaux, France. This history and these stories are the subject of today's program. Apart from our colleagues in residence here, who are our partners for the program, I want to offer my thanks to the Sousa Mendes Foundation, who has been a major co-organizer, co-sponsor, co-source of support for this wonderful afternoon. Olivia Mattis, who is the co-founder and past president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, brought the idea for this program to us and has given all of the resources at her command to make it happen. For that, we can thank, in a way, as you'll read in the biographies on the back of your programs, Consul General Sousa Mendes, who was responsible for helping Olivia's family come to America. Marion Kaplan, who is a member of the Academic Advisory Council of both the Center and of the Leo Baeck Institute, has kept a close watch on the intellectual rigor of our presentation. So for that, we thank you, Marion. As you can see from the program, we have some very distinguished guests who will provide greetings, and right now I'd like to introduce one of them to you. But just before I do, one of the people who wrote about the experience of coming to Portugal and what it meant was the niece of Heinrich Mann and the sister of Golo Mann, who was Golo and Erika Mann, who wrote this, were the children of Thomas Mann, all of them refugees from Nazi Germany who ultimately made it to the United States. Erika Mann wrote, "Lisbon, the only free and neutral harbor in Europe, has become the meeting place and waiting room for all those who have flown from Hitler. What has drawn the people to these streets is neither a world exposition nor a festival. It is the banished, the homeless who have gathered here. Their numbers may fluctuate, but they are always in the thousands. The refugees arrive here without belongings, without money, often without identification papers. And what can they do here? Only one thing: stay as long as they are allowed to. Just wait. For what? For the ship that will save them, that will take them away, anywhere, just away, further away from the enemy who was at their heels no matter where they went. He had hunted them across the whole of Europe, and now they waited for the ship that would come to save them. I hope that you will enjoy the afternoon and that you have, I know many of you, much to contribute to the conversation, and for some of you, this will be a wonderful opportunity to learn yet another story. What I would like to explain is a little bit about what's going to happen. I'm going to continue with some introductions. There will be 3 presentations. We'll have a short talk about the exhibition that's in the hall that we hope you all get to see, because then we will have an extended coffee hour, and when a half hour actually, and when that's over, we will be showing a film. As you can see on your program, it's called Lisbon, Harbor of Hope. And following that, for those of you who are still here, a discussion, a Q&A about the film and anything else you'd like to talk about. So that's the afternoon. Right now, I am very proud and pleased that the Portuguese government has sent Rui Boavista Marques, who is the Trade and Investment Commissioner here at the Consul of Portugal in the United States, in New York.
Good afternoon to you all. My name is Rui Boavista Marques, and I'm Trade and Investment Commissioner for Portugal here in the US, as well as Consul for Economic Affairs at the General Consulate here in Portugal in New York. I've been here for 3 years. We normally have international positions. I just renewed it, and very gladly I will stay in New York for 3 more years. So I'm at your disposition for any further follow-up. I'm here on behalf of 2 ambassadors. Ambassador Nuno Brito is our current Portuguese ambassador to the US in Washington, D.C. He's today in San Diego, in California, celebrating the Portuguese heritage in California, and representing also Ambassador Álvaro Mendonça Moura, is our ambassador to the United Nations, is in Portugal this week. And I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to congratulate the organizers of the event. So Judith Siegel, thank you very much for hosting this event, and of course the Aristides de Sousa Mendes Foundation, the previous President Olivia Mattis, and I'm really thrilled to come finally to meet Louis-Philippe Mendez also. And I'm particularly pleased also to thank for your presence in this symposium and the panelists that will present their papers. I believe that you are geared up to a new speed of achievements and to a greater momentum is taking place. Only in 2013, several benchmark decisions and actions took place, and I would just like to mention briefly 5. A new law that grants automatic Portuguese nationality to descendants of the victims of the 16th century Inquisition was promulgated in July 29th by the Portuguese Parliament. This might as well as be considered as awarding a key to the house of their ancestors, and certainly a very strong welcoming message from the Portuguese government and population in general. The second issue that I would like to raise is that on the cultural and tourism side of the equation, the new network of Jewish sites, Rede das Judiarias, enrolls now more than 30 locations from former synagogues, ritual baths, Jewish quarters, and new local museums. And the third achievement that I think was really important this year was not only the activities in general of the foundation, but the trip organized in July that really raised up the awareness not only in Portugal, but also here, of the potential that we have still to walk through. But it really raises a lot of awarenesses in Portugal. I'm really thankful to the Foundation for the trip organized to Portugal. The number 4 will be the Rotas de Judiarias, Rota de Sifarad. That project was announced in mid-August by the State Secretary for Culture, budgeting 5 million euros to restore and renovate Portugal Jewish heritage sites with a strong support from Norway. And here in New York, on June 26, the Consulate General, in partnership with the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, organized a seminar on the Portuguese Jewish legacy, gathering also sponsorship from the American Sephardi Federation. So I believe that this symposium will bring us to a new quality level of the discussion. And I'm really thankful for the organization, and I really have to congratulate the organizers and give you all the best wishes for a great symposium. Thank you.
So now we'll begin the program, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Olivia Mattis, without whom this whole thing would never have happened. As I said, the bios are on the back, but I think that there are a few things that I would like to pull out so that you could hear them, because they're really important here. Although it's a wonderful achievement, Olivia is an award-winning musicologist with a PhD from Stanford, but her real credentials today are as a descendant of 12 people from her family for whom Aristides de Sousa Mendes provided passage to safety. And through that experience and through her contacts, through her activism, she came to us with this program. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to her. She will moderate and introduce the paper, the delivery of the papers part and the conversation this afternoon. Olivia.
Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, I wanted to add my voice of welcome to those of Judith Siegel and Rui Marquez. I also wanted to thank Judy Siegel for agreeing to host today's event, as well as Marion Kaplan, who helped to organize it. It has been a joy working with both Judy and Marion. My father received a Portuguese visa from Aristides de Sousa Mendes when he was 7 years old. And I have known about this story all my life. 3 years ago, in September of 2010, a group of us, including visa recipients, descendants of recipients, members of the Sousa Mendes family, and supporters of the cause, decided to start a foundation whose mission and goals you have in the pamphlet in your hands. The foundation has an active research team that is seeking to identify, locate, and contact families who received visas from Sousa Mendes in the spring of 1940. Many of the families that we have identified are here with us today. So at this time, I would like to ask any audience members whose families received these precious visas and or who escaped Nazi-occupied Europe through Portugal to please stand up. I would like to ask those of you who just stood up to please stay in the auditorium after the symposium at the beginning of the coffee break so that we can get a beautiful group picture. At this time, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker. Margarita Romeo is here all the way from Portugal, where she is a curator, scholar, and historical researcher. She is the author of Lisbon, City During Wartime, She is also one of the driving forces behind a remarkable new museum being created in Portugal in the village of Vilar Formoso on the Spanish-Portuguese border. The train station in that village was the first site of Portuguese soil that the refugees encountered in 1940, and Margarida is helping to convert a couple of warehouses at the train station into a museum telling the stories of the refugees who escaped Nazi-occupied Europe through Portugal. This is a very exciting project, and the Sousa Mendes Foundation is delighted to be partnering in this effort by contributing documents, photographs, and testimonials. Margarita's talk today will be on the subject of Portugal's policies and practices during World War II and is entitled The Last Frontier, Portugal during Wartime. And I'll ask for the Q&A to be held until the end. So we're going to have the three talks, and then we'll do our Q&A. So please welcome Margarita Ramalho.
Hello, hello everybody. I'm Margarida Ramalho, Olivia told you. I'm very proud to be here today. I'm very thankful to Sousa Mendes Foundation and to Center for Jewish History for inviting me. Usually in Portugal, I never read a speech, but as English is not my language, it's just a language I learned at school, I decided to read it because, believe me, it's better for you and for me. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Portugal immediately proclaimed its neutrality, while neighboring Spain, though remaining non-belligerent, supported the Germans in many ways. This is not amazing if you realize that during the Spanish Civil War, General Franco, the Spanish dictator, had received assistance from the Nazis. Oops. Something going on? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Yes, okay. In fact, in 1941, a Spanish-German invasion under the codename Operation Felix had been planned to occupy Gibraltar, North Africa, and eventually Portugal, in order to expel the British from the Mediterranean region. Fortunately, it never took place because Franco realized that there was a risk of losing the Spanish Canary Islands to Germany. Therefore, he raised many obstacles and demanded huge amounts of money, alleging the damage this operation could cause to Spain. Like Franco, the Portuguese Prime Minister Oliveira Salazar had established an authoritarian right-wing government in 1936, though the two countries followed different policies. Portugal was a poor little country that wanted to stay out of the war. Thus, Salazar adopted an ambiguous attitude. Ideologically, he was closer to Mussolini, Franco, and even to Hitler, although, as a devout Catholic, he did not agree with Hitler's policies regarding the Jews. On one hand, Salazar wished to support the Axis. For example, he tolerated that the Gestapo kidnapped German anti-Nazis, such as the journalist Bertolt Jacob Salomon, captured at the Lisbon café in broad daylight. On the other hand, as he was a conservative politician, he was restricted by an ancient historical treaty between Portugal and Britain, and he did not wish to violate, and therefore he could not oppose the Allied powers. Salazar maintained strict neutrality at least until 1943. It is true that Portugal delivered to Germany tons and tons of tungsten, tin, turpentine, cork, and citrus fruits, but Portugal did the same for the Allies. The exchange currency that was used by Nazi Germany in its trade with foreign countries such as Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal, Turkey, and the United States often consisted of gold bars. We know that part of this gold was stolen from European Jews. Even today, it remains a controversial issue whether or not this gold should be restituted. After 1943, when it became clear that the Axis would lose the war, Salazar became more proactive to the Allied forces. He stopped selling tungsten and other metals to the Axis and leased the air and naval base in the Azores to the British, risking a German invasion for the second time. However, by this time, Hitler had other problems to think about. Now let's go back to the spring of 1940, when the German troops advanced westwards and Portugal became the last frontier for refugees for all parts of Europe. However, like most neutral countries, Portugal did not want to receive them. I do not know the reasons other countries alleged, but in my opinion, Salazar did not want the refugees to receive refugees in a period of rationing, as Portugal was not self-sufficient to feed its own population and depended on other countries, most of them at war. Of course, there were also political reasons. Salazar, Orange were humble and rural. He wished that Portugal would remain forever the same quiet, bucolic country it had been in his parents' time. He crossed the Portuguese border only once in his life in order to meet Franco at the Portuguese-Spanish frontier. All that Salazar knew about foreign countries was the information filtered by the censors and the secret police he had created. This explained why he was always suspicious of foreigners and ideas coming from democratic regimes. Jews were not welcome mainly because they were foreigners, not so much for racist or religious reasons. However, refugees come from modern open-minded countries. They were educated and cosmopolitan. Salazar feared that they would take over jobs, and even worse, he dreaded their influence on the Portuguese mentality. Until 1938, the flux of German immigrant Jews to Portugal was not very intense, and they were easily accepted by the Portuguese authorities. This was the case with the Blauvul family. However, after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany, the issuing of visas started to be carefully controlled. At the outbreak of the war, Portugal tried to stop the entry of refugees. The rules for granting visas became more and more restrictive and depended upon prior authorization by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. No visas were allowed to be issued to Jews, stateless persons, people with a nonsense passport, or people who could not return freely to their own country. In theory, the borders of Portugal were closed to almost all refugees, but things never happened exactly as planned, and Mr. Mordecai Paldiel will tell you the history of a great man, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who managed to open these doors in the wake of the fall of Paris in June 1940. Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, decided to disobey the orders of his government, and from June 11 till June 23rd, he frantically issued visas to war refugees. But Sousa Mendes was not the only one. Others, such as Teixeira Branquinho and Sampaio Garrido, did the same. In 1944, these two Portuguese diplomats at the Portuguese embassy in Budapest saved about 1,000 Jews. Faced with the arrival in June 1940 of so many people and with the impossibility of accommodating all in Lisbon, the Portuguese government sent part of them to the countryside or to seaside resorts. Most of the refugees were granted a permanent residence in Ericeira, Caldas da Rainha, Figueira da Foz, Coimbra, Coria, or Oporto. Permanent residence meant that they were not allowed to leave these areas without prior permission from the Portuguese secret police. The Portuguese are traditional, hospitable people, and even during wartime, most of them tried to help the refugees. There are many testimonies which confirm that refugees cherish fond memories of their stay. However, life was not easy. They did not know the language or the customs, and they had to keep in mind the rules of the secret police. Many of them did not possess money or legal documents, and unfortunately, there were people who took advantage of them. Despite the dangers and the losses that each of them had suffered, most of the refugees managed to feel comfortable in Portugal and could count on the support of the several, mainly Jewish organizations. Among the Portuguese organizations, I would like to mention the Portuguese Red Cross, the Portuguese Israeli Community, PIC, and COMASIS, the Portuguese Committee for Supporting Jewish Refugees created by PIC. The latter was headed by Augusto Desagui, a medical doctor responsible for the Israeli hospital and the soup kitchen, which served over 200 meals each day. This institution had also settled agreements with physicians, pharmacies, and stores in order to provide medicine and clothes. Among the international organizations were the International Red Cross, the World Councils of Churches, the World Refugees Board, the Quakers Unitarian Service Committee, and the Emergency Rescue Committee. The latter was especially active in helping those who were being persecuted for intellectual and political reasons. Besides these, there was also the joint American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which financed other institutions such as COMASIS, and was in charge of obtaining visas and arranging sea reservation. Then there was also the ISISM, an American Jewish organization that gave financial support to thousands of Jews. After what had happened in Bordeaux in June 1940, the restrictions were once more increased. Only under the control of the secret police, the PVDE, very pro-German, visas could be issued. Nevertheless, refugees continued to arrive in Portugal, especially those who had overseas visas. There was, however, a large group of people who crossed the border illegally and were helped by local smugglers or organized underground networks. In case they were not politically engaged, they preferred to denounce themselves to the Portuguese police. Usually, they were arrested for a few days, and afterwards they were sent to a permanent residence in Ericeira. They had to stay there until they were allowed to go another country. If they were politically engaged, they tried to remain underground until they had obtained legal documents to go somewhere else. Sometime later, the government's policy in granting visas to Jews changed a little. On the 4th of February 1943, a confidential aide-memoire was sent by the German government to the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In that document, Portugal is notified that German authorities would grant visas to Portuguese Jews in territories occupied by Nazis as long as Portugal would accept them back. At the beginning of the 20th century, many Sephardic Jews who descended from Portuguese families that had fled from Portugal during the Inquisition and lived abroad decided to register themselves as Portuguese citizens at the Portuguese consulate of the country in which they were living. Some revalidated their registration every year, but others did not. With the country overflowing with foreigners, Portuguese authorities decided to recognize only those who had a valid Portuguese nationality record. Sadly, this deaf and blind bureaucracy led to dramatic situations, and many Portuguese Jews were assassinated in concentration camps. Meanwhile, thanks to Portugal's neutrality, Lisbon became the center of a free Europe to which everybody flowed, and where the battling nations set up their spy networks and propaganda actions. Lisbon was the hub through which the wires of espionage ran. Reluctantly, the government was forced to allow the free circulation of foreign newspapers and magazines, as well as specific propagandistic publications. Portuguese society was divided between those who support Germany and those who prefer the British, the scale tended to weight more to the side of the Britain and the Allies. This division was felt at all levels, within the government, the diplomatic corps, the army, and even in the secret police. The free circulation of newspapers and propaganda, the large number of important people who stay in Lisbon, exiled crown heads, members of former governments, bankers, businessmen, artists, writers, movie stars, and so on, together with the tungsten business, turned Portugal into a spy land, as the British writer Nigel West called it. In Lisbon and Estoril, the cosmopolitan seaside resort nearby the capital, a complex web of espionage emerged in which secret agents, who were often double, if not triple agents, move around. This spy land has inspired writers and film directors. I think everyone remembers the movie Casablanca, where Ingrid Bergman, escaping Nazi persecution, says goodbye to Humphrey Bogart before boarding the plane to Lisbon. The writers Ian Fleming and Graham Greene, both British agents during the war, used their own experiences in Lisbon and Estoril to write their famous novels. In September 1941, Ian Fleming came to Lisbon and he took up residence in the pro-Allied Palacio Hotel in Estoril, where he frequented the casino, one of the main meeting points for wealthy refugees and other important people. Some years later, inspired by incidents that had taken place during the war in Estoril, Fleming published his first novel, Casino Royale, in which James Bond is the main character. It seems that this famous secret agent was based on the Yugoslav spy Dasko Popov, who acted as a double agent in Lisbon and Estoril. During the war, Graham Greene stayed in Portugal, and he would have heard of Juan Pujol Garcia, better known under his codename Garbo, and Paul Fitzmurk, a Czech agent also known as Ostro. These men were double agents staying in Estoril. They sold false information to the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. The case of Garbo is remarkable as the false information he provided from Lisbon deliberately misled the Germans about the location of the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944. It appears that these two double agents may have helped Graham Greene, creating Jim Wormold, the main character in the novel Our Man in Havana. Lisbon lies at the mouth of the Tagus River. During the war, there was an endless coming and going of passenger ships and cargo vessels. Apart from Portuguese ships, vessels of different nationalities made use of Lisbon Harbor, and it became a regular stage for the exchange of prisoners or diplomats. Nevertheless, the life of that harbor of hope was particularly marked by the departure of ships to Palestine and to the Americas, carrying thousands of people in search of a new life. An article published in Portugal in January 1941 gives us an account of one of these moments. It was in the middle of the afternoon. The quay was full of noise. There was an endless, tangled, twist mass of people, and final preparation for departure were being made. It was a sad crowd of people, looking apprehensive and resigned, as they were forced to depart by fate, leaving behind, in some far-off place, the remains of broken lives and pieces of their own souls. The luggage piled up on the wharf were the ruins of those bitter lives and bore witness of painful wanderings throughout a bloody Europe. The ship slowly pulled away from the quay and some time later was sailing offshore, heading for the New World. Leaving Lisbon was a relief, but also a party of exceeding sadness, as Heinrich Mann wrote. The view toward Lisbon presented the harbor. The last image of Europe faded. It seems indescribably beautiful. A lost lover is not more beautiful. Everything had given us had come from this continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita, for a beautiful speech. Our next speaker is Professor Marion Kaplan, Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at New York University. She is an expert on German Jewish life in the 19th and 20th centuries, and she has done extensive research on the refugees who escaped Nazi-occupied Europe towards the Dominican Republic. She is the author of The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, Dominican Haven, the Jewish Refugee Settlement in Sosua, and many other books. Her talk today will be on the subject of the daily lives of those refugees who escaped through Portugal and is entitled Jewish Refugees and the Port of Last Resort.
Thank you and hello. You'll see that Margarita and I have a very similar interests, but I think our talks interweave very nicely. In the opening scene of Casablanca, which you've now seen, released in 1942 and one of the 5 most popular American films ever, the camera zooms in on a map of Casablanca in relation to Portugal. The refugees in Casablanca, quote, wait and wait and wait, quote, end quote, for visas to get to Lisbon, quote, the great embarkation point for the, quote, freedom of the Americas. At the end of the film, its heroes fly off to Lisbon. Most Jewish refugees, however, reached Lisbon via more tortuous paths, fleeing by train, car, or foot through France, over the Pyrenees to Spain, and then on to Portugal, arriving destitute and forlorn. Many of them had suffered social death and violence in their homelands. Now they learned that their new European host nation did not want them to remain, adding one more link to the chain of dehumanization they bore. How did Jewish refugees experience their physical and emotional lives, and how did the contingencies of World War II and the ambiguities of Portuguese policies affect them? How did they adjust to the travails and sentiments of waiting once in Lisbon? And how did they experience their day-to-day reality? This, then, is the story of the actions and feelings of Jewish refugees caught in a no-man's land between a lost past and an unpredictable future. Before the war, Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria sought safety in neighboring countries, especially France and Holland, or in the US and Palestine. About 1/3 of German Jews had fled their homeland at this time. The vast majority did not consider Portugal, a poor agricultural country under another dictatorship, an option, even though until 1938, German citizens could enter Portugal without a visa. Most refugees hoped to move on to North or South America. In 1938, the year of the fruitless Evian Conference on Refugees and the anti-Nazi instigated pogrom of Kristallnacht, the 75th anniversary of which is coming this Saturday, November 9th, more refugees came, although a new law, Circular Number 10, allowed only 30-day tourist visas and barred aliens and Jews from settling in Portugal. Several hundred refugees arrived between 1933 and the fall of France in June 40. Most settled in Lisbon, the capital, and a lively port city of about 600,000, where the majority also of Portugal's 400 Jewish families, about 2,000 people, lived. The fall of France in spring 1940 triggered a stampede southward of tens of thousands of Jews to avoid the German juggernaut. Portugal at first demonstrated generosity, admitting trans migrants with even the slimmest evidence. Because of Portugal's relatively liberal practices and illegal entries, a flood of harried and dispossessed refugees arrived in Lisbon without the proper papers. By July 1940, Lisbon had emerged as the best way station for Jews to escape continental Europe for the Americas. Between 40,000 and 100,000 people reached Portugal in the year 1940 to 41. In October 1940, American reporter William Shirer logged in his diary that Lisbon served as, quote, the one remaining port on the continent from which you can get a boat or a plane to New York. That same month, the main German Jewish newspaper in the United States, the Aufbau, reported, quote, New emigres from France and from German-occupied territories arrive constantly. Lisbon is sold out. While tens of thousands soon continued their exodus by boat or plane to distant shores, Lisbon housed about 8,000 refugees in December 1940, most of whom had gotten into the country with useless visas, and among whom Jews made up about 90%. In early June 41, about 14,000 Jewish refugees required shelter. At that moment, the Nazis directly or indirectly controlled most of Europe. A few weeks later, 3.9 million Nazi troops invaded the Soviet Union. Portugal proclaimed formal neutrality on September 2, 1939, one day after Hitler attacked Poland. Thus, European Jewish refugees had to read mixed messages. On the one hand, Jews perceived the anti-immigrant sentiments of the government and the police, and poor refugees had to produce transit visas to show they planned to move on. On the other hand, they also noted the lack of specifically anti-Jewish reactions in the Portuguese population. Consciously or unconsciously aware that Portugal had driven out Jews or forced them to convert in the late 15th century, Jewish observers reported that currently Portugal did not have a Jewish question. As late as 1941, a Jewish refugee could assert, quote, "The Portuguese do not persecute foreigners, refugees, or Jews." Moreover, even when Portugal placed restrictions on immigrants, Jewish newspapers noted that the country still welcomed Jews with capital or businesses. In addition, individual Portuguese consuls courageously came to the aid of refugees against the desires of the government, such as Portugal's General Consul Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and you'll hear more about him. We should remember, however, that had the United States acted expeditiously in accepting refugees, the Portuguese would likely have offered temporary visas far more readily, since Portugal officially accepted trans migrants. Although ultimately taking about 130,000 refugees before the end of 41, within this period, the U.S. had left 110,000 available quota slots unfulfilled. The refugees experienced a roller coaster of emotions as they coped and waited to journey on. Their previous ordeals with fascism and escape and the continuing hardships of family and friends reverberated. In addition, the frightening process of having come with the right or wrong papers haunted them. Quote, "There were things that were now in our blood like sort of a poison. They were called work permits, residence permits, identity cards, temporary safe conduct, gasoline rations, exit visas, transit visas, and entry visas." Reactions to the exigencies of daily life, the highs and lows of refugee existence, included very warm feelings toward Portuguese individuals, terror of the secret police, camaraderie with other refugees, as well as an utter sense of isolation. In particular, the refugees, having fled their homelands, leaving family and friends behind, mourned their losses. They experienced the torment of not knowing what their loved ones faced, or worse, of suspecting what they faced. Like those refugees who came in the 1930s, the later refugees of the 1940s appreciated the compassion of the Portuguese, which made a lasting impression. After the fall of France, many arrived flat broke. As Alma Mahler-Werfel tried to pay her Portuguese hotel bill, the clerk, quote, "seemed to sense that it would leave me short of cash. 'Never mind paying the bill,' he said. 'I'll advance it for you, and you can send me the money from New York.'" Others report receiving fruit and flowers upon their arrival from residents of small towns. One woman on a train heading to Lisbon and obviously starving eyed a young girl eating bread. The conductor, observing her glance, offered her a whole loaf of bread and gave her a place to lie down in first class. And if Portuguese citizens wondered about the unusual dress or behavior of refugees, especially women, or the fact that refugees lingered in cafés, since few locals knew of the work restrictions placed by their government, they didn't let on. Indeed, that refugees could not compete for employment with Portuguese citizens surely helped the relationship between those groups. Also, the JDC, a major American Jewish philanthropy you may know as the Joint, supported the refugees and also recognized the friendliness of the Portuguese people and the cooperation of the Salazar government. The New York Times as well confirmed Portuguese kindness at every level. On December 15, 1940, reporter James Reston, who may be a name familiar to all of you, noted, quote, "The Portuguese people have taken the refugees into their homes and given them clothes, for many arrived with nothing but what they wore at the time. And the government has consistently extended their visas to allow them to remain here until new homes can be found." It should be noticed, however, that just as the refugees praised the Portuguese for their hospitality and kindness, they feared the Portuguese secret police. Indeed, the refugees generally separated the kind Portuguese from the harsher Portuguese government and police in their minds and in their memories. This self-deception notwithstanding, as late as 1944, even the German embassy, probably to its consternation, noted the absence of anti-Semitism in Portugal. As the Jewish refugees tried to make sense of their new environment, they felt physically but also psychologically in transit. Most saw Portugal as a way station. Instead of Lisbon's beauty and special attractions, the harassed newcomers focused their psychic energy on, quote, freedom and peace. Only one more step, and Europe with its oppression and hatred lay behind us. They no longer concerned themselves with bombing raids, blackouts, or food rationing. As they entered Lisbon, Felix Bauer, freed from a Swiss internment camp, felt, quote, an aura of peace. Lisbon was, again, according to him, the first place that was normal in 2 years. It was a place with civilization. We were in seventh heaven there. Certainly, most refugees needed financial and logistical assistance. Local and international aid organizations that Margarita already mentioned took on these tasks. Starting in the summer of 40, Lisbon ranked second only to Geneva in the amount of Jewish organizational activity. Many Jewish organizations supported refugees in a spirit of solidarity with Jews in trouble, but also to prevent them from burdening the state. All of them, to some extent, provided sustenance and shelter and also attempted to find visas and ship passage, always negotiating with the Portuguese and American governments. Also, the Portuguese Jewish community used its own political influence to protect the refugees and help them obtain transit visas. Despite sunny, peaceful, and relative safety where refugees lived in the small towns and in Lisbon, they continued to feel intense dislocation, a crisis of identity, and steep, drastic downward mobility. For the most part, they had lost their middle-class existence, including their homes, their jobs, and their previous lives. Quote, "We lost touch with the soil. We were cut from the security of bourgeois life, with no work, no home, no homeland." Some had no passports or valid identity papers or permission to reside, even temporarily, in Portugal. Their languages, their friends, and their relatives remained behind. Now they stood unprotected by citizenship and bereft of psychological belonging. These wounds festered, as did the economic dislocation of being a refugee. Most depended on Jewish philanthropies. Their, quote, bewildered looks and the condition of their clothes announced their plight. Still, crumbling clothes proved the least difficult problem. Crucially, they had lost a sense of self. Hannah Arendt, a refugee herself, captured this moment, quote, "Once we were somebodies about whom people cared. We were loved by friends and even known by landlords as paying our rent regularly." Arendt summed up the feelings of exasperation of a middle-aged man who had appeared before countless committees in order to be saved, and finally exclaimed in exasperation, "Nobody knows here who I am." He mourned for his previous identity and his former place in the world. And yet, clinging to one's old status while watching it disappear caused grave disorientation, frustration, and sadness. These identity crises sometimes merged with what later generations have called post-traumatic stress disorder, a type of intense, uncontrollable anxiety that can occur after one has seen or experienced an event involving the threat of injury or death. Even when they didn't suffer the extremes of PTSD, many refugees unable to work, supported and guided like children, felt discontent and despondent. Observers noted frayed tempers, and one aid worker agonized about the fragile emotional state of these supplicants. Quote, "Since they are near the edge, some go off the handle in my office." Driven to despair, some also committed suicide. Arthur Koestler, the writer, tried to commit suicide there, and another refugee recalled suicides when the American consul turned people down. Jan Lustig, another writer, believed many of the refugees were often close to suicide. Arendt, writing in 1943 about the refugee condition, also dwelled on suicide. Fears of spreading war ranked highest among the worries. The thought that Hitler might invade Portugal gnawed at terrified Jews. Although they really did not experience the war except for headlines in an assortment of foreign language newspapers, many in Lisbon, people like Hansal believed that the Jews were deceiving themselves. Hitler had occupied almost all of Europe. Why should he spare Portugal? He continues, "We had to ensure a passage before it was too late." Even in a small seaside town outside Lisbon, where the Barinholtz family, quote, "went to the beach every day," they kept maps on the wall following the armies in the war. And the refugees didn't harbor exaggerated fears, as the suspicions and behaviors of Americans there attest. Waitstill Sharp of the Unitarian Service Committee in Lisbon heard that 60,000 Nazi panzers stood at the Spanish border in the summer of 1940. William Shirer's diary in October 40 read, quote, "For some time I've been getting information from military circles that Hitler is making ready to go into Spain in order to get Gibraltar." The apprehension of Jews in Portugal made sense between 1940 and the end of 1942. Both Jews and Portuguese only showed relief when the Allies landed in North Africa in November 42. Quote, "The palpable fear of a Nazi march through Spain into Portugal lifted. As a Portuguese put it, quote, Germany no longer seemed invincible." Getting through the day took determination, nevertheless. Refugees prioritized the search for basic shelter and food. But leaving Portugal, due both to Portuguese insistence and to the refugees' own desire to leave Europe and start a new life, dominated their actions. Lodgings ran the gamut from small rundown rooms to more spacious apartments. Private families and pensions also offered temporary accommodations. Sig Adler found a, quote, "pleasant guest house in downtown Lisbon where he enjoyed food, including rice and wine." Crucially, aid organizations subsidized the rent bills and the food bills. One man remembered many versions of sardine dinners because, quote, "that was the main affordable food." And others trekked up the Lisbon hills at noon to receive a free hot lunch, and you saw a photo of that a moment ago. In order to acquire proper papers, Carla Pekalis and her husband turned their room into an office, while Alex went out to, quote, "visit consulates, police commissioners, travel agencies in search of a million things, travel permits, proof of citizenship, money exchange, ship passage, and so on." She pounded out letters on the typewriter addressed to friends and relatives, especially in New York, with requests that went from a simple testimonial authenticated by a notary to the all-important affidavit that would place the responsibility for our future on the shoulders of whoever acted as our guarantor. These repetitive errands to consulates and aid organizations demanded time and attention. Seeking extensions to remain in Portugal or new visas, they waited on endless lines. And here we're quoting Erica Mann again, but a different one, a different quote. On a short trip to Lisbon in the fall of 1940, after having acquired a visa from England, she still had to appear at the police office for foreigners. She walked 8 minutes to the end of the line. The line at the American embassy seemed to have, quote, "no end at all." The lucky ones made it into the waiting rooms of various consulates, those vestibules of heaven and hell. Disoriented and at a complete loss as to the next step to take, refugees stood bewildered and heartbroken as consuls turned them away. While waiting, refugees faced a jungle of consulates, police stations, and government offices, bureaucratic red tape, loneliness, homesickness, and withering universal indifference. Alex commented, quote, "One day someone will tell the story of these waiting rooms. It will be too late for those who fell by the wayside, but it might bring catharsis to those who survive." Carla, his wife, summed up, I love this quote, "It would have taken the pen of a Kafka to depict the world of visas in all its surrealistic absurdity, that of a Dostoevsky to render the nightmare of the petitioner's struggle for survival." After days of wrestling with consuls and charities, refugees spent anxious moments at the post office waiting for letters from loved ones. Letters from war-torn Europe, intermittent and censored, not only underlined the deep connections among families and friends, they provided a lifeline, a desperate attempt at human solidarity. Letters urgently and straightforwardly pleaded for food from Lisbon. And clearly the refugees sent abundant food parcels. Sardines ranked among the most nutritious food gifts sent eastward by the Lisbon refugees. Labels from packages sent from Lisbon to individuals in Theresienstadt, the ghetto concentration camp near Prague, indicate that canned fish and canned foods made up the majority of contents. And a notebook and letter kept by one refugee in Lisbon listed dozens of food parcels that he had sent to friends languishing in the Gurs camp in Vichy, France between 1940 and 41. Chocolate topped his list of foods, followed by sardines, cheese, and meat. The highs and lows, the roller coaster of emotions, alerts us to the refugees' anguish and moments of relief. In hope and despair, they sought bonds with other refugees. They constructed temporary spaces, communities, where they could evoke the one milieu that might make them feel better, a cafe culture in which they could share impressions and feelings with others going through the same upheavals. When refugees finished their recurring visits to consulates and organizations and shipping offices, where they couldn't help running into each other, they visited cafes. The refugees sat in cafes, bridging national, ethnic, and gender differences for the moment. These tables even bridged class differences. The cafes created a social space of mutual experience, a kind of diasporic homeland. Because they had left the landscape, urban feature, and knowledge of belonging to their nations behind, they resorted to the only public space that felt private and that they could afford. The cafe emerged as a new transnational and temporary home for a vast variety of European Jewish refugees. This corner of their new urban landscape offered a setting where they could, quote, speak the language we hungered for, and where, quote, one heard more of German and French than Portuguese. An ephemeral world of cafe identities allowed most Jews a semblance of normalcy, a place to remember who they once were and feel recognized by others from their previous worlds. No longer simple sites of culture and sociability, Lisbon cafes offered indispensable locations in which to exchange advice and rumors about the war and about possible visas. The refugees recognized each other immediately and quickly developed relationships talking about, quote, problems, family, anxiety, what happened to other members of the family. They shared angst and empathy. They bonded quickly, creating a temporary solidarity. The writer Herman Keston endowed the cafe with symbolic meaning. Quote, in exile, the cafe became home and homeland, church and parliament. The cafe becomes the only site of continuity. I sat in cafes in dozens of lands of exile, but it was always the same cafe. I only have to sit in a cafe and I feel at home. Jan Lustig described the cafe more practically. The emigrants sit in cafes with hollow cheeks and rimmed eyes, stick their heads together and talk. Day and night, day and night. One says with a sigh, visa. Another smiles ironically and bitterly, visa. The third gives a long, excited speech, but one understands only, visa, visa, visa. Stretching their cups of coffee for hours, women and men found solace among people in the same situation as they mourned the losses they had experienced. Frequently enough, the cafes offered more than solace or food. Sometimes one could acquire black market boat tickets. There they sat, quote, hatching little plots to get precious tickets. As Valerie Marcoux grew more and more desperate to find a ship ticket, he knew he had to resort to go-betweens found in the cafes, and they carry their offices in their pockets. They asked for double or triple fare, even more if they could. Cafe rumors further provided hints as to which shipping agencies had come across extra tickets. The cafes, these international spaces in which the sexes mixed and families, including children, found seats, underwent a radical transformation from Portuguese male spaces in those years. Young Northern and Eastern European women, very much part of the cafe scene in their own hometowns, now sat in Lisbon cafes, chatting, gesturing, writing, smoking, and doing needlework. Some even wore pants, and most went without hats, something only prostitutes did in Lisbon. The cafe offered a neutral ground for them to feel at home and preserve their customs. Quickly, refugee women noticed that Portuguese women did not frequent cafes at all, and that one cafe refused to seat unescorted women at night. In fact, an author, Ilza Loza, wrote that women who went out alone after dinner could be taken for prostitutes. Portuguese observers, according to age and class, found refugee women's behaviors either outrageous or fascinating. The Portuguese police also ticketed and fined women for wearing French two-piece bathing suits. Cafes also presented opportunities for new, fleeting friendships among refugees. Most refugees shared the same situation. All needed similar documents. The cafe provided that meeting space. But these must have been somewhat strained relationships. They depended on each other, but they were also competing with each other for the scarce visas and shipping space. Commiseration vied with envy. Erica Munn observed that while cafe goers all rejoiced for a lucky woman about to embark for the US, they were, quote, all also jealous of her. Once a refugee acquired the visa, repetitive errands to shipping agencies ensued. Ship tickets or the lack of them caused grave concern. Hannah Arendt said the whole process of emigration reminded her of the German children's game Mensch ärgere dich nicht, akin to our game Sorry. Just as one's pawn neared the goal, someone would bump it back to start. When the Romanian writer Marcoux approached clerks in the steamship company to buy a ticket for the US in February 41, quote, they looked at me in surprise as though I had come to ask for their daughter's hands. I wanted something quite normal, and I am regarded as a madman. In Portugal, the refugees felt increasingly perplexed and stymied. In February 41, the Aufbau noted that refugees with US visas have been waiting for months. And here, meaning in Lisbon, one can't understand why America doesn't send a larger ship at least once a month. Refugees visiting Lisbon's Cook travel agency, longing for any spot on any ship, wondered how the huge US liner Manhattan could advertise for a Hawaiian cruise when people desperately sought to escape Europe. In April of that year, Life magazine displayed photos of refugees jamming into the American export line office, although tickets had been sold out until February of the following year. Obstructions notwithstanding, by mid-42, most had managed to emigrate. Yet even on board that coveted ship, and this is going to be a funny, Margarita and I didn't speak, but it's the same ending as she has almost. Yet even on board the coveted ship, countless memories haunted their joy. 14-year-old Mara Vishniak, the daughter of the famous photographer, felt a deep sadness as she realized that fleeing also meant abandoning Europe. Jewish writer Eugen Tillinger watched the port of Lisbon disappear and evoked, quote, the most beautiful scenes from the European past, Baroque and Gothic. I saw the towers of Prague, the sweet Austrian landscape, Paris, a whole life spent in Europe. Freedom could not be other than bittersweet. Thank you.
Our third speaker this afternoon is Dr. Mordecai Paldiel. Currently on faculty at Yeshiva University and Touro College, he was for around 25 years the director of the Righteous Among the Nations program at Yad Vashem in Israel. He is an expert on Holocaust rescue and was himself rescued by a righteous Gentile during the war. He is a champion of the memory of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. When I invited him to join the advisory council of the Sousa Mendes Foundation 3 years ago, he immediately said yes, saying, "I will support any effort to honor the memory of Sousa Mendes." If any of you know of a righteous Gentile who deserves to be honored by Yad Vashem but hasn't yet been, this is the man you should speak to. Professor Paldiel's talk today is entitled Aristides de Sousa Mendes, Disobedience in the Cause of Humanity.
If I ever get to Lisbon, one of the first places I will visit some of these cafeterias that you mentioned. Maybe I'll have some kind of experience there. Well, good afternoon. Here's my talk. It was a momentous event without precedent in Portugal's history. On March 13, 1988, the Parliament in Lisbon officially threw out the verdict against a former diplomat who had since died and had been punished for disobeying orders from above by granting thousands of Portuguese transit visas to Jewish refugees in World War II. The man was cleared of all charges, and his name was restored to the rolls of the diplomatic corps. The vote was unanimous. Born in 1895 into an aristocratic Portuguese family, Aristides de Sousa Mendes entered his country's diplomatic service and was posted in various places. In August 1938, he was appointed Consul-General in Bordeaux, France. 2 years later, in June 1940, Bordeaux was flooded with thousands of refugees, among them many Jews who desperately wished to leave a defeated France and escape the war-torn continent of Europe via Spain and Portugal in advance of the German army, whose troops were within striking distance of Bordeaux. Mendez's home country was then ruled by dictator Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who also served as foreign minister, and whose regime increasingly exhibited fascist-style behavior. Already earlier, in November 1939, 2 months after the start of World War II, Mendez was instructed by his government that no visas were to be issued to certain categories of people, and especially Jews, without prior approval by the Foreign Ministry. When it was learned in Lisbon that Mendez was disregarding these restrictions in some individual cases, he was reminded in April 1940 not to repeat these irregularities and warned, and I quote, that any new fault or infraction in this regard will be considered disobedience and give rise to disciplinary proceedings, end of quote. Mendez evidently attached no importance to this warning, for he continued to issue transit visas to certain small groups of people, acts that were recorded in his file back in Lisbon. Then, in May 1940, persons fleeing ahead of the advancing German army, Mendez, doing his nightly rounds of the refugee encampments on the street of Bordeaux, met Rabbi Chaim Kruger, a refugee from Belgium, and invited him to the consulate, which also served as the consul's residence. After listening to the rabbi's travails, Mendez offered Rabbi Kruger and his family transit visas, but only to them. The rabbi, however, turned down this friendly gesture. He would not take advantage of his position and leave his brethren behind parked on the streets. as told by Rabbi Kruger in a post-war account, which incidentally was written in forwards in Yiddish. I thanked him for his generosity and returned to our brothers stranded outside. I then went back to him and explained that there was only one avenue of escape, to give all of us visas to Portugal. This presented Mendez with a moral challenge of incalculable proportions. A month earlier, on May 21st, before the flood of the refugees had turned into an avalanche, Mendez had asked Salazar, his boss, the foreign minister and leader of Portugal, for instructions on how to deal with the refugees seeking Portuguese transit visas. The answer received was a plain and simple no. To ponder his decision, Mendez secluded himself for several days in his bedroom, where he was heard tossing and turning and occasionally groaning. His family wondered what had become of him, as he alternated between states of great agitation and self-imposed silence. His son, Pedro Nuno, noticed this change. And Pedro says, all of a sudden my father seemed terribly worried, as though he had been struck down by a violent disease. Another son, Sebastio, remembered the change in his father's eyes and hair. His eyes had blue circles around them. His hair had turned completely gray, as white as snow, almost. After 3 days of isolation, Mendez announced he had made up his mind. As recalled by his son, Pedro Nuno, and I quote, my father got up, apparently recovering his serenity. He was full of punch. He washed, shaved, and got dressed. Then he strode out of his bedroom, flung open the door to the chancellery, and announced in a loud voice, from now on, I am giving everyone visas. Then our father told us that he had heard a voice, that of his conscience, or of God, which dictated to him what course of action he should take, and that everything was perfectly clear in his mind. It was June 1940, a week before French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned and turned over the reins of government to Marshal Philippe Pétain, who told the nation that France had capitulated to the Germans. During this momentous interval, a chaotic situation prevailed in Bordeaux, as all expected the German army soon to be within the gates of the city. Large crowds besieged the foreign consulates, especially the Portuguese Consul-General. The following day, Mendez began to sign visas with no questions asked. Consular Secretary José Seabra tried to dissuade him from this new course in flagrant violation of instructions from above. For the sake of your wife and children, please stop. You're ruining your life and your family. But Mendez paid no attention to this. It was the start of one of the greatest rescue operations carried out by a single individual. Again, a single individual. As also reported by Rabbi Kruger, I sat with him a full day without food and sleep and helped him stamp thousands of passports with Portuguese visas. In other words, Rabbi Kruger himself was stamping the Portuguese visas. Mendez explained to his staff, my government has denied all applications for visas to any refugees, but I cannot allow these people to die. Many are Jews, and our Constitution says that the religion or politics of a foreigner shall not be used to deny him refuge in Portugal. I have decided to follow this principle. I am going to issue a visa to anyone who asks for it, regardless of whether or not he can pay. Even if I am dismissed, I can only act as a Christian, as my conscience dictates. My desire is to be with God against man rather than man against God. As the word spread outside, a long line of people thronged outside the consulate, anxiously awaiting their turn to have their documents stamped with the Portuguese transit visa. as also witnessed by the consul's nephew, Cesar Mendez. Inside the dining room, the drawing room, and the consul's offices were at the disposal of the refugees. Dozens of them, of both sexes, all ages, and mainly old and sick people. They were coming and going, pregnant women who did not feel well, and people who had seen their relatives die on the highways, killed by air fire. They slept on chairs, on the floor, on the rugs. The situation was out of control. Even the consul's offices were crowded with dozens of refugees who were dead tired after waiting for days and nights on the street. When Mendez learned that Faria Machado, the consul in Bayonne, located on the French-Spanish border, a city under the jurisdiction of the Bordeaux consulate, was refusing visas to refugees there, Mendez hurried there to bring the consul into line with his new policy. He lectured the vice consul, Manuel Vieira Braga. He told him, "Why do you not help these poor refugees? How would you like to find yourself, your wife and children in the same circumstances as refugees? You say you're here to carry out the instructions you receive from your superiors. Very well. I am still the consul at Bordeaux and consequently your superior. I therefore order you to pass out as many visas as may be needed." Mendez even decided to help refugees with the crossing itself and directed some to avoid the direct route between Hendaye in France and Irun in Spain, and instead use a side road, farther uphill, on the assumption that the border guards would create less problems since they probably had not yet been told not to honor the visas issued by Mendez, as the Portuguese government had most likely requested. By then, Mendez knew that he was in deep trouble with his own government. Indeed, infuriated at Mendez's insubordination, dictator Salazar ordered one of his aides, Armando Simeão, to go immediately to Bayonne to see with his own eyes what exactly was happening there, and to report directly to Pedro Pereira, the Portuguese ambassador in Spain. At the same time, on June 23, 1940, Salazar took the first punitive steps by stripping Mendez of most of his authority, and in particular, the right to issue visas. The next day, Salazar ordered Mendez's immediate recall to Portugal. A day later, the Spanish ambassador to Spain, the Portuguese ambassador to Spain, Pereira, accompanied by two aides, met Mendez and began to berate him. "Orders must be obeyed," they lectured him. To this, Mendez responded, "Not if those orders are incompatible with any human feeling." Returning to Madrid after his encounter with Mendez, Pereira related that when he met Mendez in Bayonne, he was struck by the man's so-called erratic behavior. In Pereira's words, this man was disturbed and not in his right mind. He appeared not to have the slightest idea of the enormity of the acts committed. I had no doubt in stating my conviction that the said consul had lost the use of his faculties. This is a sad reflection that during the Nazi period, to be a humanitarian, one had to be, so to speak, out of one's mind. More trouble awaited Mendez after his return to Portugal on July 8, 1940. On August 2nd, Mendez was handed an indictment, which included charges relating to both the period before June 17, when he issued visas to individual persons without prior approval by the foreign minister, and to the period after that date, when he issued thousands of visas to fleeing Jews. He was accused of having acted in a way, to quote, that was dishonorable for Portugal vis-à-vis the Spanish and German authorities, end of quote. On August 12, 1940, Mendez submitted his defense against these charges in a 20-page document. Regarding the many people who were given visas, Mendez emphasized, It was indeed my aim to save all those people whose suffering was indescribable. Some had lost their spouses, others had no news of missing children, others had seen their loved ones succumb to the German bombings which occurred every day and did not spare the terrified refugees. This filled me with commiseration for so much misfortune. Add to this the spectacle of hundreds of children who were with their parents and shared their sufferings and anguish. Because of the lack of accommodation, this multitude slept in the streets and public squares in all weather. How many suicides and how many acts of despair must have taken place? All this could not fail to impress me vividly. I, who am the head of a large family, and better than others understand what it means not to be able to protect one's family. Hence my attitude, inspired solely and exclusively by the feelings of altruism and generosity. Mendez ended his defense by stating that I could not differentiate between nationalities, as I was obeying dictates of humanity that distinguish between neither race nor nationality. Countering this, Ambassador Pereira repeated before the board his previous conviction that the accused had evidently gone out of his mind. I got the impression of a deeply disturbed man who was not in his normal state. There was not the slightest doubt in my mind when I told the Spanish authorities that the consul had taken leave of his senses. The disciplinary board's ruling was that Mendez was guilty of insubordination and premeditated unacceptable behavior. It also rejected the extenuating circumstances surrounding the refugee situation at the time. At the same time, it recommended that the punishment should be limited to demotion in rank. Salazar, however, decided on a stiffer punishment. On October 30, 1940, he ruled that Mendez should be dismissed from active service for 1 year on half pay, then be forced to retire and forfeit any benefits due to him after his long diplomatic service to his country. After his dismissal, Mendez reportedly told Rabbi Kruger, whom he met again in Lisbon, "If thousands of Jews can suffer because of one Catholic," in other words, Hitler, "then surely it is permitted for one Catholic to suffer for so many Jews." He added, "I could not have acted otherwise, and I therefore accept all that has befallen me with love." With a family of 12 children to feed and without any other income, Mendez was forced to sell his estate in Cabanas de Viriato. Soon he was reduced to poverty, and he died in 1954 a broken-hearted man. 2 of his children were held by HIAS, a Jewish welfare organization, to move to the United States. The man himself seemed to have been forgotten. In 1966, with Portugal still ruled by Salazar, Yad Vashem declared Aristides de Sousa Mendes posthumously righteous among the nations. In 1987, Mário Soares, president of a now democratic Portugal, bowing to pressures by children of the late diplomat and concerned organizations, awarded Mendez the Order of Liberty. A year later, the Lisbon Parliament took the final step of restoring Mendez's name to the roster of Portugal's diplomatic corps. Subsequently, the government ordered damages to be paid to his family. Presently, many streets and secondary schools in Portugal bear the man's name. And in 1994, the city of Bordeaux, where Mendez made his fateful decision to help the refugees, paid him tribute by inviting Portugal's President Soares to unveil a statue of Mendez on a major roadway. Adriano Moreira, who served as a minister in the Salazar government, stated that the significance of Mendez's action is that he attacked a principle which had hitherto been absolute, that orders must be obeyed. The Nuremberg Tribunal established that people are also responsible to obey certain principles and that they cannot act against human values. The great quality of Sousa Mendes was that he obeyed the values of mankind. So stated Mr. Moreira. In 1985, 19 years after his recognition as a righteous, realizing that for some unexplainable reason, no one of either the Mendez family nor a representative of his so many thousand beneficiaries had come to plant a tree in his name in the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. And fearing that this special and unique garden would be filled to capacity with trees by other well-deserving righteous, as indeed happened later, I took the unusual step of myself planting a tree in a place that would afford visitors to conveniently gather next to the tree bearing the name of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and for them to reflect on the man's sacrifice in the cause of a humanitarianism without parallel. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our speakers to come up here, and at this point I would also like to invite up my good friend Louis-Philippe Mendez, president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation and grandson of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. Are these on? Okay. 3 wonderful presentations. Okay, so I'm going to ask some questions of each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So first of all, I'd like to turn to Louis-Philippe, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about your family's experience, about your father, and the impact of Salazar's punishment on your family, and then a related question of how does it feel today to see the appreciation of the families of the visa recipients and the entire Jewish community, I would say, for what your grandfather did.
Thank you, Olivia. It's an open question, and I'll try to have the best answer I could. So I'm the grandson of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. My father was the second last of a 14 children family, and Aristides de Sousa Mendes was married to Angelina, my grandmother. They both decided, my grandmother always supported my grandfather in his decision, and she stood strong with him. That's important to bring up at this point. And then, all across those, from 1940, the Jewish community has always been strong support for our family. From those days, from this point, you know, at my point in the third generation, looking backwards, I could only say that there's and the presentators brought it up as well, there's a natural friendship beyond barriers between the Portuguese and the Jewish community. And being born in Montreal from a French-Canadian mother, I hadn't had the pleasure to know too much about the Portuguese culture because my father just turned the page, and my mother, she naturally didn't speak Portuguese, and so in my position right now, and with the the support of always this Jewish community that elected me as a large part as a president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation today. I could only say that from all across that story, the Jewish community has been strong with us, and that it's a beautiful story to look into.
Could you tell a little bit about your family history, about how your father got to Canada, and a little bit of why he had to leave Portugal and those kinds of things?
Sure. My father has written a beautiful testimony. It's available on the site of our foundation. So he was 12 years old when in 1940. Before that, well, he was born in the Tui in Spain while his father was working there, and he joined at number 13 of this family. All the kids were born in different countries around the world, and they were a happy bunch. They lived 10 years in Belgium just before going to Bordeaux. So most of his childhood, my father was happy in Bordeaux, and as a matter of fact, here in this room, there's a friend of him in those days, Jean Duvivier, who was in grammar school with my father. And it's really amazing to meet him today for the first time. So after those years in Bordeaux, in Belgium, at 12 years old, my father crossed the line between a happy childhood and a dramatic adult life. So he stayed with his parents until he was 20 years old. And then he took the boat to cross to Canada, to Quebec, where there was a friend of the family who was at the head of Université Laval and in Quebec City. And there, after spending those 9 years with his parents, helping them out, my father wrote down that it was the hardest day of his life to be on that ship and to see his father on the turnaround and leave from the port. So in Montreal, he started his life. He really turned the page, and he concentrated in his profession, and he was always in touch with his brothers and sisters because they had that mission from their grandfather and their grandmother, their father, I'm sorry, to make sure that one, to lead constructive lives, and on the other hand, to make sure that one day everyone would know that the way that those refugees were saved was the action of a proud Portuguese who obeyed the Portuguese constitution and his conscience. So that generation of my father really went through their lives struggling hard, and they finally succeeded in their mission, in both of their mission, but they suffered a lot. I'll stop here if you want. If I could go on, but please.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn now to my immediate left, to Mordecai Paldiel. Could you please explain the difference between the different kinds of visas? Because all of these refugees needed all kinds of visas in their passports. How come some of them are just considered bureaucratic formalities, whereas others were acts of rescue? Can you explain the difference?
Okay, the basic visa. Oh, I'm sorry. It's on? Okay. There were several kinds of visas. First of all, you needed... Oh, that's yours. What you needed is what is known as an end visa. An end visa means a destination visa. You had to show that you had a place where to go as your final destination. So most people preferred, of course, to come to countries like the United States or Canada, or to other Latin American countries, and that was very difficult to get an end visa from these countries. Once you had an end visa, then you needed a transit visa because you had to transit to those countries, okay? So you had to go through Spain or Portugal or via Turkey or via the Soviet Union or via whatever country would lead you on the way to your destination. So that's the transit visas, and that's where Portugal came in, and Spain came in, and Turkey came in later on, and Switzerland, and some other countries. So people were trying to get desperately transit visas as well as end visas. Some people were lucky to have a British certificate to go to Palestine. Under the white paper, there was a certain very small number of people that could go to Palestine, so they could get a visa to go to Eretz Israel, to Palestine, and then also they needed some transit visas to get there. And then you needed what is called an exit permit, exit visa. In French, it's known as laissez-passer. In other words, if you were in France and you were trying to get to the United States, and if you're lucky enough to get an American visa after getting an affidavit from a sponsor, I mean, it's a whole mishegas, really. And you already have a transit visa, then you had to go to the French police station and get what is known as a laissez-passer or an exit visa, allowing you to leave the country based on if your police record was clear, you paid all your taxes. So you have the exit visa, basically, the transit visa, and the end visas. These are the three holy principles, the Trinity visas that you needed in order to get out. And it was, for most people, I'll just give one example of the father of Anna Frank, Otto Frank. Otto Frank, before World War I, was here in the United States. He worked for part-time in Macy's, went back to Germany. Yes, and then in World War I, he served in the German army, and then after Hitler came to power, he moved to Holland. When he was in Holland, and fearing that a war would break out, he tried to get to the United States. He had several cousins here, and he wrote to them, and he wanted to get a visa, an American visa. And the cousins were told to go to certain immigration officers. They had to fill out statements that Otto Frank and his family would not become a public charge. And the immigration authorities gave them a hard time because these distant cousins didn't have enough income and enough savings in the bank and steady jobs. So it took years and years and years. And finally, they succeeded in getting the affidavit, which was approved by the State Department. And Otto Frank was told he could get a visa. But by the time he got this notification, he was in Holland, and Holland was occupied by the Germans, and the United States was already at war with Germany after December 41. He was told, you have to get to Portugal, to the nearest American consulate, in order to get the visa, actually, the American visa. How did you get to Portugal via occupied Belgium, occupied France? And so he decided to go into hiding in Amsterdam, and there Anna Frank wrote her diary. So for many people, it came too late.
Now I'm going to turn to Margarita, and I'm going to ask you about something you briefly touched upon in your talk, and that is the gold, the Nazi gold. Is it true that there are still over 400 tons of Nazi gold in the Bank of Portugal, and what does the Portuguese government plan to do about it, to your knowledge?
I have no idea. It's a very difficult question. I have absolutely no idea. But as we talk before, I asked a friend if it's true if the golden bar exists. And I suppose not. I suppose that the gold bars coming from Germany was spent during the colonial war, the Portuguese colonial war. So there are gold bars in Portugal, but not from this time. And I really don't know what the Portuguese government intends to do. Sorry. Maybe it's useful that Portugal asked Germany to pay because this gold became from Germany, and the German had stole this gold from the Jews. So it was very important if Germany restitute this money. Thank you.
May I make just one more comment? There were also other ambassadors. There were Spanish diplomats in various stations who issued transit visas so people could go through Spain. Several are now being examined by Yad Vashem. So some have already been recognized. And one of them was the Spanish Consul-General in Bordeaux, Prope de Callejon. And I believe his son, who is here in the United States, is here among in the audience. Are you here, Mr. Prope de Callejon? No. Okay, so this Spanish diplomat issued a transit visa to go through Spain. And the assumption is that the person who got the transit visa then could go to Mendez's office and get a Portuguese transit visas. Some of them simply took the Portuguese transit visas and came to the Spanish border, and they were allowed to go through. Others had also a Spanish transit visas, and this gentleman, Prope de Callejon, was also honored by Yad Vashem.
Marion, in your talk, you focused on the Jewish refugee experience in Lisbon, but can you talk a little bit about other towns? I mean, my family, for example, was in Coimbra. I mean, other families were elsewhere. So can you speak about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up a moment again on the visa situation because it was crucial. The story of Walter Benjamin is a very good one in that sense. He had the entry permit to go to the United States. He had the visa to be in Portugal. He had the visa to cross Spain, but he didn't have the French exit visa. And when he got to the border and the police stopped him, that night he committed suicide. So in fact, every one of these visas was sort of a lifeline. And if you didn't have them all, you were in big trouble unless you could sneak across the border, which many people did, but that was luck. Getting back to the question I was asked, the Portuguese government didn't want all the refugees to wind up in Lisbon. It was getting real, it was sold out, as I said, and it was really, really hard to place them. And also, I think for surveillance reasons, they wanted them spread out. So they put them into, and Margarita mentioned this, some of the resorts. You saw the red dots on the map that she showed you. And those were small villages, fishing villages mostly, with beaches. And there were significant small Jewish communities in those places. And one of the things I discovered was, I was very interested, since the Portuguese in general were so kind to the Jews, I was interested, well, did it go beyond that? Were there any friendships? And it turns out that in the smaller villages, people did get to know each other and did become somewhat more friendly, whereas in Lisbon, they hung out with each other because there was such a big group of them. So the small villages they all had philanthropies helping them. There was a little library in one, there was a little synagogue. I wouldn't call it a synagogue. There was a room where people went for prayer services. There were also cafés. Cafe is a big deal there. And I'm trying to think what other part of the question they lived in usually little apartments. Or if there were individuals, they lived in boarding houses. But families were generally given small apartments. Apartment could be 2 rooms, but that was still, you were sort of on your own.
But didn't they have to get permission from the secret police to even leave their little residences?
Yes, those were called fixed residences. Thank you for reminding me. Those are fixed residences, which meant that if they wanted to get those visas that we've been talking about, or those ship tickets, they had to get to Lisbon. So they needed permission each time. And whereas today, it might be an hour to get to 1 or 2 of those places, in those days, it was a long trek, and they needed the permission. So on the one hand, the Portuguese administration wanted them out. On the other hand, it made it hard for them to get the papers and to be doing what I call the paper chase in Lisbon as much as they needed to be in Lisbon. So yeah, there was that issue.
I'd like to say something more about visas. Once you did get a visa, it didn't mean you could take a boat and get off and leave. I'm talking about before the war. Before the war, if you were in Germany and you got a visa, then in many cases you had to wait in line because it was a quota system for the number of people that would be admitted from Germany. So if you did already receive a visa, and then you could be told your number will come up like in 2 years or 3 years. You had to wait because of the quota. So what did people do? They said, well, I want to get out of Germany when it was still possible, before the war. So they went to Cuba or to Venezuela, to other countries, and said, I'll wait until my number comes up, and then from there I'll go to the United States. That's what happened to the people on the St. Louis. They had been approved, most of them, for emigration, for visas to the United States. But they had to wait a year or two, and they didn't want to wait. It's 1939, the war clouds were gathering. So they decided to take on a visa to Cuba, and in Cuba, they were going to wait a year or two to get to the United States. But once they were on the boat, they were told that the Cuban government had passed a new regulation. You needed a landing permit, which something new. They didn't have a landing permit, so the Cubans refused for the passengers in Havana to disembark. When the ship was docked in Havana and no one knew what to do with the St. Louis, we're talking about 927 people, 927 or 29. And then the Jewish organizations then petitioned the State Department. These people have already been approved for immigration. But they cannot go now, but in a year or two. Let them go in now and deduct that from the quota. The State Department said, no, we can't do that, because if we allow this, there will be some other ships, and some other people are going to use the same trick. So that's why the St. Louis boat was denied, and it had to go back all the way to Europe.
So I'm sure that there are questions from the audience. I mean, many of you lived through this, so please, anyone who has a question, let me know. So come up to the microphone if you wish to ask a question. Please come up to the microphone. Whoever wishes, you can already come up to the microphones. Oh, I see. You're going to pass around. Good.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify on the visa. So Sousa Mendes was issuing transit visas. That meant that the people who went to him had N visas already?
In Cuba, I believe what they had is tourist visas.
I'm talking about Sousa Mendes now.
Oh, Sousa Mendes?
When he's in Bordeaux, is he issuing transit
Sousa Mendes
visas?
transit visas to pass through
So those
Portugal.
people had N visas, or he was just issuing transit visas without them having?
That's it.
Both.
Both, yeah.
Both.
Thank you.
Hi. How did Sousa Mendes come to Yad Vashem's attention in the first place?
Good question. It happened in the 1962-63, when suddenly Portugal, still ruled by Salazar, some people in Portugal, encouraged by the Portuguese government, they came out with a report that Portugal helped Jews to escape from the Nazis. And they pointed out to what was mentioned in these lectures of the thousands of Jews that passed through Portugal, and that Salazar is not such a bad person after all. He helped Jews to save themselves. And later on in Budapest, in 1944, the Portuguese diplomats, they also helped Jews. And so one of the daughters of Sousa Mendes, who happened to be in New York, I believe her name was Joanna, and she wrote letters to the newspaper, and he said, Salazar is lying. My father was persecuted by this man. And so some articles came out then in 1962-63 about this whole issue of Salazar. And this came to the attention of Yad Vashem. And we received the short statement by Rabbi Chaim Kruger, who I believe was still alive. He has a son in Jerusalem. And Yad Vashem then decided in 1964 to add his name posthumously to the list of the righteous. So all of this resulted as a result of the debate that came out about Salazar, who was still in power in the early 1960s.
Did you want to add something?
I noticed one of the slides was a slide of the synagogue Shaarei Tikva in Lisbon, and I'm curious about the role of the organized Jewish community, in particular the synagogue and the rabbi at the time.
Yes, I don't know if I can explain everything, but the Portuguese community, the Israeli Portuguese community, was helping Jewish for many ways. They have the Comasses. It was another institution created by this community that helped. They have medicines, they have clothes, they have the soup kitchen and the hospital, and the synagogue was the meeting point in Lisbon where all Jews, when they arrive at Lisbon, they come to the synagogue to see if her friends, her family arrived there. It was a meeting point. I don't know if, what do you want to know more?
So I asked the question because I'm very proud to say that I'm the granddaughter of Rabbi Avram Kastel, who in fact was the rabbi in Shaarei Tikva from 1910 to 1945, and he in fact was quite involved, as you described, in the...
Maybe you could tell us more.
Regrettably, I don't have any more information other than what you have said, and which has been substantiated by my family and actually and people in Lisbon with whom I've spoken, that it was my grandfather who in many ways was responsible for placing immigrants in homes in Portugal and finding places that they could stay either for a short time or for a long time, and of course providing or getting access to them for provisions and anything which they wanted. I also had an aunt who was working for the Salazar government, and whatever she could do behind the scenes, and of course it was never discussed at home, and this was all very kind of secret stuff. She was able to do whatever she could behind the scenes working for Salazar.
Actually, Mark, there's also Amzalek.
He was friend of...
Yes, and he was a friend of Salazar's, and he was the head of the Jewish community there, not the rabbi, Amzalek.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a controversial figure, but still, he was a good friend of Salazar's, and he had his ear. So Salazar himself, I think, is a very ambiguous figure.
Very
and so I really think that that's important to understand also. By the way, just a moment, those of you who may still have letters, diaries, or memoirs of your folks, make sure that you speak to, where are you? Frank Mecklenburg here from the Leo Beck Institute, because it would be fabulous if you gave copies or originals, whatever you feel like, to the Leo Beck Institute so that this just doesn't disappear into dust at some point. So keep that in mind. It's really, really important. That's how we get our sources,
yes.
Right? That's how we're writing our books.
How many visas have been documented, and is there any documentation of people who were rejected once the Mendez visas were considered invalid?
Yes, the Sousa Mendes Foundation has a very active research team, and we're trying to answer that question. I can't see who asked the question. Can you raise your hand?
Hi.
Oh, right here. Okay. So we've, at this point, identified 3,000 individual Sousa Mendes visa recipients by name. So we don't know if that's 10% of the purported 30,000, or if it's more or less, or what it is. We don't know what the total will end up to be. And so we're trying to find these families and document what happened to each family, one family at a time. And, well, the situation is different in different cases. So we know that there were families who got to the border too late, when the border patrol had been told to disregard these visas. And a lot of those people went into hiding, and some of those people were then deported and killed. Other people made it to safety in America or safety in Brazil. There were a whole bunch of Dutch visa recipients who boarded a Dutch vessel in Bordeaux. They didn't go to Portugal, but that very day they got the visa, they heard there was a ship leaving to England for Dutch citizens, and that ship was torpedoed and sank, and all those people died. So one visa was, you needed rescue after rescue to make it. So all the people who made it, who are here in this room, it's a veritable miracle.
And if I may just add up, the number of 30,000 visas is taken from Portugal official papers. It's the number of refugees that was numbered by the government at that moment. That's my understanding of things, and this came up even in the recent article that was found, written in 1946, I believe, by a journalist, a Portuguese journalist that kind of deep throat, who couldn't come public in Portugal, so he sent a letter in the United States, could you complete? And so it was published in the paper in the New Bedford at the time, I believe,
Yes, there's a Portuguese newspaper, Diário de Noticias in New Bedford, Mass., that published a long article in 1946 from an anonymous journalist who had a pseudonym, Onyx, O-N-I-X, was a pseudonym, where he mentions this 30,000 figure. He says Sousa Mendes issued all these visas. It wasn't Salazar who rescued these people. Salazar is currently persecuting this man, right? 1946, he was still alive. And the world needs to know what's going on. Okay. So that 30,000 figure is in that 1946 article.
Yeah. It's just because the 30,000 is a figure that the joint gives for all the refugees that passed through Portugal.
No, there were many more than that.
Well, that's the figure given in 1940, 1941 by the joint, which include all the refugees who passed through other countries.
Yeah, what I simply would like to add to this conversation. I never refer to 30,000 or 20,000 or who knows what. And when I speak about Raoul Wallenberg, I don't say 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, because you get into trouble. You can't prove that. But I say that Mendez certainly issued transit visas to thousands of people, or else Salazar would not have gotten involved and have him removed and fired and disciplined and everything, made a case out of him if he had simply issued 5 or 6 visas. So we're talking about thousands, and that's good enough for me and for everyone. So,
and also I wanted to point out that some of those visas, some of those refugees never made it to Portugal because they had to go into hiding and so forth.
If we knew the number of people who were rejected.
Yeah. I'm going to ask that we have one question up here, and we can take one more down there. And then we're going to have I want to briefly introduce Dr. Frank Mecklenburg. We have coffee and pastry, and then we have a film. But there's plenty of time for you all to talk among yourselves and with our distinguished guests. So we have one question up here, one you can find down there.
I would like to get back to Rabbi Castell's granddaughter. I knew Rabbi Castell. I grew up in Portugal, and I left Portugal in 1941 at the age of 15. Rabbi Castell had an assistant rabbi, Rabbi Diesendruck, who had originally come from Austria. He organized a youth group for the refugee children, teenagers, and it was a continuously changing group of people because some people came, some people left. But there was this youth group to get the kids a semi-normal life, if you want to call it that. There were also families in Portugal who had children, my father included, who would invite children, the age of their own children, to come spend time with them so that these children, these refugee children, would have a temporarily normal day or two.
What was the position of the Catholic Church in regard, did they assist or stay neutral or say anything during this period?
Vis-a-vis what?
With regard to the refugee, the Jewish refugees coming into the country,
Well,
and giving assistance to them.
You want to?
Did the church have any position in it?
I can't. What I can do is start the answer by telling you that while he was punished, my grandfather turned towards he was looking for help, for support, and he turned to the church, finally, the answer he got is pray. Pray for help. So that was about their position. They were very much linked to Salazar, and they shared the power together, and they put their limits where they thought was best for them, and they didn't stood up, to support my grandfather. So it tells you a bit about the rest of the refugees.
I want to say a profound thank you to Olivia, and to our guests for both the most informative and also the most moving testimonies that we could hear about this. Before you leave, I want to introduce to you, because we have others, I think this is such an incredible example of Jewish history. Here you are sitting in an audience, and you are probably sitting next to somebody who was part of this history. So there are yet others to introduce you to. I want to introduce you first to Dr. Frank Mecklenburg, who is the director of the archives of Leo Baeck Institute.
Before you go to have your coffee break, I want to point out we have a small exhibit out there which gives one example of a family where you can see the original documents, which is one of the many treasures that we have here at the center. And I want to emphasize what Professor Kaplan was saying. Please see that you have original documents, family materials from the time that pertain to this, that get rescued, saved, and here at Leo Baeck Institute and the Center for Jewish History is the best place to do that. It all comes together. And I just want to say that this small exhibit is an example of one family. Actually, we have one of the daughters here with her children. And this is a small exhibit about a few documents, a family that came already to Portugal in the mid-1930s, in the early 1930s, to flee from Germany. The father actually had fought in World War I for Germany, had a bullet lodged in his leg, which unfortunately got infected. And in 1937, he had to undergo an operation, but because of the lack of proper medical care, he died of that infection. So the family, the woman was widowed. Her two young daughters then in 1941, at the end of 1941, could go with a transport of children under 16 organized by the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, come to the United States. She separated from her two young daughters, and she actually had to stay in Lisbon. And one of the pictures that we have in that exhibit is she worked for the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. There's a picture of VE Day when they were all cheering the liberation of Europe. So if you have a chance, please go and look. And I think the family will stand around It's Gabrielle Greenberg. Are you? She's in the audience all the way up there. And her cousin, actually, Gerda, who was also on the boat, who is also here, and the two children of Gabrielle, and you probably can meet them at the exhibit. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, which is the woman who was talking about being a teenager and working with Rabbi Castells in the Portuguese synagogue. When I made a plug for you to send letters or memoirs or diaries, people like you should also write their memoirs about that moment in time and give it to the Leo Beck, because that is missing. We don't have much from kids who were teenagers at the time. We have from their parents or sometimes from children, but that's a really interesting story that I don't know about, and I think it would be really helpful. So get to writing.
Before you all go off on your coffee break, if those of you who are going to be in the picture, who were visa recipients or escaped through Portugal, if you could stay for 5 minutes, let everybody else go to the coffee break and you'll join them in 5 minutes.